Okay, I'm really here to talk today about data lakes and data warehouse loader patterns, and a bunch of other stuff slipped in. And that's the usual thing that happens. You think it's targeted, and then you end up with a little more things to talk about. So really, what I wanted to talk about here originally was data lake, data warehouse loader patterns, and whether you should do dependent or independent ingestion. Should the ingestion of a data lake and a data warehouse be independent of each other, or should they be coupled somehow, maybe in a sequential pattern? So I'm going to talk really quick about the assumptions here. And these are just kind of throw out. You could be different. Data is the big IP in your company. You have a bunch of it. You're either living in the cloud or you're moving to the cloud, because basically big data doesn't live well on-prem anymore. It's way easier to do in the cloud, and the data warehousing in the cloud is really cool compared to what's on-prem. You want to leverage that data to improve every process, and you want to speed access to your data to either create better customer experience, better corporate experience, or better regulatory experience, or maybe everything. Better visibility to what's happening. So we're talking about data warehouses and data lakes, and why are we going to do two of them? Because if I'm going to put my data somewhere, can I get by with just one? And the answer is maybe. It kind of depends on your company. So the pros, we're going to use the data repository that is fit for the purpose you have. So if you have different use cases where there are different tools that make use of it, or there are different access patterns, you need massively parallel, you need SQL access, whatever, then in that case, makes a good case that we might actually store the data in a way that we can get to it two different ways. And so in this case, that would be possibly storing it twice. And the last pro I just put here is consumption pattern diversity. And that's because you might have different tools in different ways, people, programs, machine learning, something else that needs to get access to the data. And so those data repositories might be better, one or the other. The cons of this, you pay for storage twice. It's not twice the cost because the storage costs differently. Data lakes tend to be the cheapest storage. They also have cold storage, and data warehouses are a little more costly. They have formatted storage and organized storage. But with modern storage and cloud pricing, it doesn't make that big a difference. It will when you get really large and you're using the heck out of it, but then hopefully you're using it the right way and you're getting the benefit of it. Consumption pattern diversity is actually a pro, but it was also a con. If you have more than one data storage with different access patterns, then people have to figure out which one to use when, and that can be confusing. The other cons are access control. So this is command and control, or basically protecting the data. You have different access controls in different data storage styles, and so you would need to learn how to manage both of those. And the other thing, which is sort of related to the consumption pattern diversity, if you have more than one way to do something, you got to convince people or teach people what the right way was to do it. You always have more than one way because they could go against operational stores and other things, but it's just something to be aware of. If you do it once, you only got one thing to manage. If you do it twice, you got two things to manage, but you have a whole bunch more flexibility. So it's really up to you what you want. Let's assume that you've decided that you want a data lake and a data warehouse. So I said streaming here, but it could be ETL. So there are basically three ways. Basically what we're looking at is we have three different data sources, data stores. We have the originating data store, operational data stores. We have a data lake and a data warehouse. And for each of these, what we do is we drop the data in a raw zone for the lake and the warehouse. And then in the lake world, you'll hear it often called curated. We're going to do something with that data and we're going to approve it. We're going to see if it's valid to be shared. In the warehouse world, you might conform it. You might translate it into a consumer-oriented fashion, right? So we move from a producer schema to a consumer schema for both of these potentially. But either way, the data gets laid down in the raw zone and then you do something with it. So in a parallel load, the originating system puts the data somewhere. In this case, I assumed it was streaming, but it could be anything. You put the data in both the ingestion for the lake, and the warehouse would pull them in simultaneously, and then they would do whatever their internal processes was to push the data down. In the warehouse first model, we would assume that the warehouse is more of a gold source than the lake. It becomes a superior data source to the lake. We put the data in the warehouse. The raw zone in the warehouse is replicated into the data lake, and then both the data stores do their own thing for either they're conformed or curated, and they proceed independently of each other from that point. One other thing here, you do have a regulatory issue on any of these. If you have right to be forgotten or other things, you're going to have to remove that data everywhere, something to be aware of, and I will probably update this sometime. The last one is lake first, and that's where the data lake is the kind of the gold standard for all the data in the company or more of the data. And so data flows into the lake, and then it's transited through the lake into the data warehouse, and both the lake and the warehouse take care of their own processes. So pick your strategy. Which one do you want? Parallel, lake first, or warehouse first? So the advantages, I'm going to cover a little bit of differences in these. So parallel, you load the data to both without waiting for the other. So one could be ahead on a given data source and the other could be ahead on a different data source, right? You got to decide which one's going to be the gold source for analytical data. Is it your lake or your warehouse? I've worked last two places I've worked actually had the reverse policy. One, the lake is the gold source and the warehouse was a copy, and in the other, the warehouse is the copy and they're debating on making warehouse was the gold source and they were debating on making the lake the copy. And in parallel, you can do filtering restrictions without having to do pass-through, so you could decide that sensitive data or something else isn't going to go into one of those, and they would just take care of it for you. Whereas if you pick one of the strategies where you filter through something, that data source has to take everything that it could accept and everything that the other one could accept. I think if ML and reporting are primary use cases, machine learning and reporting, I would actually argue parallel makes sense because machine learning a lot of times tends to run against the data lakes, and reporting almost always runs against something that's SQL, and that would be a data warehouse. If you look at the lake first strategy, the lake becomes the gold source for your analytical data. If you want the lake to be the gold source for analytical data, then you would use lake first. If ML is your primary use case, then a lake makes sense. If you're big data analytics, you're doing Hadoop or your Hive or something else, then the lake makes sense to be the initial. If you have a lot of binary data, call recordings, images, lake first makes sense because a lot of times you're not going to put the binary data in the warehouse. Parallel would work for any of those use cases though, right? So these are different optimizations around the processes that you want to do. Warehouse first, basically if the warehouse is first, then the warehouse is the gold source for your analytical data, right? And if reporting is the primary use case, we don't do machine learning. We don't do training. We don't do big Hive jobs where we run in parallel to try and make sense of something. In that case, warehouse probably makes sense to make the warehouse first. So if human analytics are really what you're doing and you're not doing a lot of machine or you're not doing a lot of big data sharing or some other things, then the warehouse first. There are some, I threw out sharing in there, but there are cases where data warehouse as data sharing is the right way to go. If you're running like Snowflake and you're running Data Mart, you can share with your partners and the data warehouse will take care of that for you. So you got to pick your strategy. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. I try and keep this under my time limit. Parallel with separated loads and operations. The pros are there's no dependency between the lake and the warehouse. If one is down, you can still get data from the other. There's no serialization delay because neither one is waiting on data to pass through the other. They're both sitting on the same data source, so there's no transmutation problem there. They have the same physical source, so they both import exactly the same way. And cloud vendors really a lot of times talk about doing stuff in parallel. You have unlimited compute, so just do it that way. The only con is you're eventually consistent here. You don't know which one will be correct first because they load at the same time. If we go to first lake, then the warehouse, everything is in the lake strategy. That tends to be what some companies have. Everything will be in the lake, and then some things will go to the warehouse. I worked a place where we did that. So the lake was first. It was upstream of everything else. Actually, in our case, we made that a parallel load, but the policy was still the lake, then the warehouse. Big data jobs need to run soon as possible. We're doing a lot of binary data, so we want to put that in the lake, and then maybe we won't pass that through to the data warehouse where binary is bad in databases a lot of times. The cons are the analytic delay, chaining dependencies here. You got the lake has to be up and all the pass-through has to be working for the data to make it to the warehouse. Pretty much the reverse of the warehouse, and then the lake is true. The warehouse first strategy, everything will go in our warehouse and we only put things in the lake if they're needed for ML. So this is kind of human analytics first. The downside is the lake is a second-class citizen. It has sort of a legacy vibe to it, to me. You typically see this places where they had a data warehouse before and they're sort of in the cloud, but not really. You have these chaining dependencies like I talked about before, and the lake only sees the data if the warehouse accepts it. And I don't know what you're going to do with binary. If you don't put binary in the warehouse, how would it get to the lake? You would end up with a chained parallel combo, which is sort of ugly. Minor notes on binary and sensitive data. Databases and data warehouses really aren't a very good fit for binary data. That just never worked that way. It's up to you. Binary data is best accessed in its native format, so native storage tends to be good, and that's something the lake might be better at. Call recordings and other binary data might have highly confidential information. That makes it where you have to do a high level of masking in the data warehouse. You have to just assume it's highly sensitive, and so does it even make sense to put it there? Probably nobody should be seeing that if you got your act together. And then if you have highly confidential information like call recordings and binary, you may actually need to segregate your data. And in that case, you might end up with 2 data warehouses or 2 data lakes. It's easier to do 2 data lakes than it is 2 warehouses, but warehouses have good access controls. And so maybe that's the route you want to go. I just wanted to call this out at the end. So that's really it for patterns. If you're going to run a lake in a warehouse, you got to pick which pattern you're going to use, document it, and tell everybody about it, and then figure out how the controls and the reconciliation is going to work. Have a great day.